Hello, this is a mini lecture on Burlington Northern versus United States and involves essentially the question of liability under CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, the Superfund statutes, the liability of arrangers' disposal of hazardous waste. Right? Arranger liability usually is thought to encompass the liability of generators of hazardous waste, usually because the generator is involved in arranging for the disposal by picking the transporter or picking the waste disposal site, for example. The facts in Burlington Northern are relatively straightforward, and the key issue here involved the Shell oil company and the spills that were the result of chemicals that it had sold and shipped to one of its customers. The customer was Brown and Bryant, a pesticide manufacturer, and the way Shell was getting its chemicals to B&B was by railroad. During the unloading of the chemicals, some spills of the chemicals onto the ground. The spills eventually caused significant contamination of the soil and potentially also groundwater. The state environmental regulators and also EPA stepped in and eventually ended up taking a response action to clean this up. It incurred quite a bit of costs because the spills were quite serious in the process. And while this was going on, Brown and Bryant ended up going insolvent and therefore went out of the picture in terms of being able to bear any of the cleanup costs. Brown and Bryant were the ones, the customers, of course, receiving the chemicals and would have been a logical target for the regulators to go after. So the two remaining deep pockets in many respects were the railroads and also Shell Oil Company. The railroads, as part of the lawsuit, unfortunately also owned the land where the transfers of the chemicals occurred. And so they were liable as landowners, a relatively straightforward analysis and liability finding. But Shell was really the key issue, the question of whether Shell would also be liable as an arranger of a disposal. The reason why this was tricky is because Shell, of course, in this transaction was simply trying to sell a raw material, a product. They weren't trying to dispose of the chemicals. This was something that was had commercial value, and they wanted to get it to the customer, of course. At the same time, they also knew or were able to foresee that in the transfer of the chemicals from the railroad cars to the trucks and the containers of the customer, there would be spills that would occur in that transfer. And so that really then presented the questions for the court, whether Shell might be tagged with arranger liability. The district court and the Ninth Circuit found that Shell did become liable because they could foresee, and by virtue of being able to foresee these spills and continuing to engage in that activity, they essentially, under the broader policy rationales of CERCLA in the first place, that is to capture and cast a wide net for finding responsible parties. The rationale was that if they could foresee that spills would occur and they still continued it, there is a culpability that comes with that. In addition, the statute itself included under the definition of what constitutes a disposal terms like leaking and spilling, unintentional acts as opposed to something that was purposeful, right? A placement, sort of the idea that comes with a quote-unquote disposal, some purposeful discarding of materials. The definition included unintentional actions, and therefore the Ninth Circuit and the district court found that Shell could fall within that type of arranger liability. On a review by the Supreme Court, Shell was able to persuade the court it should not be liable. And really the bottom line here is that the Supreme Court was not persuaded by the idea that being able to foresee spills, that in itself justified an inference that the action was purposeful or the transaction expected and desired for a disposal to occur. Supreme Court was not persuaded simply thought that foreseeability was not enough. And so that essentially limits arranger liability to actions taken by the generator that are purposeful in nature.